morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm Amber Duke, joined at the desk again by Niall Stanage. Good morning, Niall.
Good to see you, Amber.
Great to see you too. We're, 3 days out?
I know, it's ticking down all the time. It'll soon all be over, Amber. That's the thing.
The anxiety needs to leave my body. All right, we're going to get right into it, of course. We are days away from the presidential election. Polls still show the two candidates are neck and neck. 538 has Harris with 47% and Trump with 46% of the vote. Both Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump will be campaigning in Wisconsin today.
Tensions are high everywhere, and former President Trump is lashing out verbally at those he deems enemies. During an onstage conversation with conservative commentator Tucker Carlson in Glendale, Arizona Thursday, Trump had this to say about former GOP Representative Liz Cheney. Cheney, of course, now campaigning with Vice President Harris. Let's watch.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face. You know, they're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy. But she's a stupid person.
Now, let's remember that Liz Cheney helped to lead the January the 6th investigation in Congress, and of course she was one of the very few Republicans to call out Trump for his role in the assault on the Capitol. Cheney responded on X this morning, "This is how dictators destroy free nations. They threaten those who speak against them with death. We cannot entrust our country and our freedom to a petty, vindictive, cruel, unstable man who wants to be a tyrant."
Trump isn't the only one to observe that neoconservatives are infiltrating the Democratic Party. The Bulwark's Jonathan Lass sat with his crew to give their final thoughts on where the race is, and this is what he had to say. Let's watch.
To me, they had clearly been like, look, it's our last chance. We're going to do it all in this speech, right? So we're going to make sure that people know child tax credit, and we're going to build housing, and we're going to cap insulin prices, although I kind of thought they already did that, but maybe I don't have my policy as correct. But here was the thing about the cheering that I loved. Speaking of Stonewall, but also I think it's amazing when you get 75,000 presumably libs on the ellipse, and she's like, we're going to have the most lethal fighting force. And people are like, yeah. And she's like, and we're going to secure the border. And people are like, yeah. And I was just like, this is, and she's, you know, we are going to be leaders in the world, and we're not going to let these guys push us around. And I was like, man, the world's really changed.
Did the neocons just take over the Democratic Party? Don't say that.
Yeah, don't say it.
Oh my gosh, they're so joyful about this.
Very cheerful about it, which is quite alarming in all sorts of ways, as you have this weird confluence of people who had been quite far to the right in the Republican Party, Liz Cheney included, now sort of swinging over to the Democratic side, and then you've Trump being Trump in the middle of it all, being, for my money, rather too gleeful or almost sort of semi-excited about this imagery of guns trained in Liz Cheney's face. I don't think that really helps anybody very much.
I guess. I thought the full quote was fine. I mean, this is a common rhetorical device to talk about the neoconservative position, which is these are people who sit in an ivory tower and they make decisions about mostly working class kids who go off to fight wars. And so I thought it was a little weird that the media was getting so ginned up about this idea that he's making the point that Liz Cheney will never actually have to face the potential consequence of those wars, which is getting killed on the battlefield, more than they care about the kids who actually get killed on the battlefield.
So I think if one were to be generous enough to assume that Trump's actual meaning was what you just said, I think that would be fine. It is, as you say, quite a standard thing about armchair generals, people who are keyboard warriors encouraging other people to go and fight their wars for them. I think that could be legitimately something that Liz Cheney is criticized for, certainly could be something that Dick Cheney is criticized for. I think Dick Cheney famously said during the time of Vietnam he had other priorities while people were being conscripted to fight in the jungles of Southeast Asia. So that is certainly a valid point. I just took what Trump said about Liz Cheney to be less about that principle and more Trump's vindictiveness or desire for retribution against Liz Cheney for her opposition to him in various ways.
I don't know if I agree with that. I do want to, let's read a little bit more of it, because I think in context I mean, the imagery is intense for sure, but in context, it is pretty clear that he is talking about her warmongering. He says, in response to a question about Liz Cheney's impact on the Kamala campaign, well, I think it hurts Kamala a lot, actually. Look, she's a deranged person, but the reason she couldn't stand me is that she always wanted to go to war with people. I don't want to go to war. She wanted to stay in Syria. I took them out. She wanted to stay in Iraq. I took them out. I mean, if we're up to her, we'd be in 50 different countries. She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle, and then, of course, we know the rest of that. And then at the end, he also says, she always wanted to go to war with people.
But you skipped over a little bit what he actually said after
Well, I just
the
didn't.
Cheney thing.
Well, sure. I didn't think we need to read it again since we did it in the intro.
Well,
but.
except that my point is when it's saying like 9 barrels in her face, I think there's an element of glee that he's taken in that imagery that is beyond the argument about neocons. Trump, I guess, does make the argument that America should intervene in fewer places or should be less interventionist generally. And as you kind of alluded to, that's an argument that one has been traditionally more accustomed to hearing from the left or from liberals. Trump, did put people like John Bolton in his administration, a guy who's never really met a Middle East country he didn't want to bomb. Yeah. And so that argument about neocons gets confused in Trump's case. I don't necessarily... If his argument is Liz Cheney wants people to fight in wars that she would not personally sacrifice for, sure, you can make that argument. I just think his argument is also this enemy of mine, deserves bad things to happen to her.
We'd have to agree to disagree on that one, but going to your point as well about his personnel decisions, which is totally a valid one, because of course in 2016, part of his America First package was getting the U.S. out of foreign wars, being more judicious about what conflicts we were getting involved in. He promised to end the troops in Afghanistan, to bring them home. And he did appoint people like John Bolton, who were traditionally war hawk neoconservatives. And he talked about that in the recent Joe Rogan interview as one of his biggest regrets from his first term. Does he know the right people now of who to put in those positions to make sure that his agenda is enacted properly? I don't know. He also talked about it in quite a funny way about how John Bolton was quite a little guy and him standing there and the world knowing that he was a crazy war hawk was kind of beneficial to him because he got to project this image that we would bomb you at a second's notice. Yeah. But I think one of the weirdest parts of this election cycle is the rehabilitation of the Cheneys by the Democratic Party. It's bizarre to me. I can't figure it out besides they just are taking anybody who's a former Republican because they're trying to appeal to that voter base, I guess.
So when you talk to the Harris campaign, their argument is that arguments about Donald Trump's fundamental unfitness for office purportedly land better with people in the center ground or a moderately right-wing position if they come from former Republicans. That is their argument. I'm not sure what the pro-Liz Cheney constituency is. Socially, she's way to the right of most Democrats. Whenever she was in her own primary, she got absolutely annihilated by a previously unknown, now Congresswoman Harriet Hageman, whose main asset was Trump's endorsement. And then there's the additional question, of course, of bringing Cheney to somewhere like Michigan. She and her father very identified with wars in the Middle East in a state where Harris has real difficulty with, yes, the Arab American population, but also a broader progressive wing of the party who don't like the Biden-Harris policy on that topic. So the efficacy of Liz Cheney in that context is lost on me.
Yeah, I completely agree. And your point about her position socially being very conservative, and her voting record in Congress was very conservative. She was scored really well by the American Conservative Union. And I think the fact that she's even willing to endorse Kamala against Trump does suggest that her primary calling card, her passion project, is foreign policy. And that's a problem for the Harris campaign.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that this is the whole question of whether Harris can expand her base to encompass, Nikki Haley voters, essentially, or not, is going to be obviously a central question in this election. The Harris campaign believe they can do that. I'm skeptical of that idea, because I don't necessarily, if you were literally Nikki Haley, there are lots and lots of things that you disagree with Kamala Harris on. Haley herself notably has endorsed Trump, though there's all this question about her not being used on the trail and so on and so forth. So this idea that there is a strand of the conservative population who are just waiting for a cue to vote for Harris, I'm not too sure about that.
Yeah, just based on my read on this and the conversations I've had in conservative circles, this is really a sort of beltway phenomenon, and it's not something that can be replicated around the country, and certainly not in swing states like North Carolina, where the Harris campaign says they're really making a push to rural Republican voters, which boggles my mind.
Yeah, I mean, on the Beltway point, remember there was that vague idea that Liz Cheney was going to run like an independent campaign for presidency, and I thought, like, you might get some, you'll get the number of votes that are around the table on Morning Joe or something, but beyond that, I don't think so.
A Liz Cheney Joe Manchin ticket, wasn't that the dream at one point?
Which was the dream of like 7 people in the world, I think.
All right. Always good to find a few areas of agreement. We're going to cover more on the election and other topics on Rising right after this.
Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's creation thought to be the blueprint for a second Trump administration, has been the left's kryptonite on the campaign trail. But Democrats may have overlooked another conservative organization currently planning for a potential Donald Trump victory, the America First Policy Institute. Established in 2020, the conservative think tank has crafted policy proposals for a second Trump term. From the economy to immigration, AFPI is said to have already drafted over 300 executive orders ready to be signed on day one.
Our next guest served as acting Homeland Security Secretary under the Trump administration from 2019 to 2021. A year later, Chad Wolf took over at AFPI, and here to discuss what AFPI has in store should Trump be reelected is Mr. Chad Wolf himself. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start with a potential immigration agenda. Trump has talked about potentially doing mass deportations, which is a position we should note is supported by the majority of Americans. But I think a lot of people are curious about how exactly that proposal would be carried out. Is the idea to implement something similar to an Eisenhower-era policy that had military operations, or what exactly would be the infrastructure behind carrying out perhaps tens of millions of deportations?
Well, let me first start off by saying that I don't speak for President Trump or the campaign, so my thoughts are just those based off of my experience serving the president during the first term. And when we talk about deportations, it's really important to note here that there is actually an entity inside the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, Enforcement and Removal Officers, that are already here, that already do this job day in and day out. Unfortunately, over the last 3.5 to 4 years, we've seen some of the record low number of removals or deportations. So first and foremost, it's just allowing those officers to do their job. You've got to prioritize. You want to make sure that you are targeting the worst of the worst, right? Those are the national security. Those are the public safety threats. Those are individuals also here on final orders of removal. And then you've got to effectuate those returns. Obviously, you got to repatriate and remove them back to their home countries if they don't have a legal right to be here. So there is an entity inside the department. There's personnel dedicated to this. I think you could start there, but then there's a lot of options once you start to scale it. And you start to move up. There's other federal entities, federal law enforcement, state and local law enforcement want to help, want to be part of the solution here. They haven't had that chance over the last 4 years. So look, I think there's a lot of options on the table, but I think it first starts with defining who is able and eligible to be removed from the country, and then just allowing law enforcement to do their job.
Chad, I want to stick with immigration for a second, but a slightly different strand within it. A group that it seems to me we hear less about these days are the so-called dreamers. More than 3 million people fall into that category. And it strikes me that even outside of the normal ideological boxes that people might fall into, there is, I think, a fairly broad appreciation that people brought to the United States as children, perhaps very young children, are in a bit of a different category to people who cross the border illegally as adults. What do you think is the way forward for dreamers?
Well, I think it's really important to really define that population. You used the term dreamers, and I think the number you mentioned is 3 million. I'm not aware of that number. If you just look at the DACA population, and that's a population that the Department of Homeland Security, for obvious reasons, tracks very carefully, there's only about 600,000 of those. And I know members of Congress and others want to include more individuals in there, but the DACA program administered by the department is about 600 to 650,000 individuals in that. And look, I've said for years now that this is a population that Congress needs to decide what is its future. It continues to be in limbo. I think every court, there's been a lot of different court proceedings and lawsuits on this issue. When they look at the merits of this program, it goes back to that President Biden, Secretary Johnson, and others did not have the legal authority to actually put this program in place. And court after court after court has said as much. And so, look, this is for Congress to decide what is the future for this population. But again, I've been on record saying, as Congress debates that and they decide that, we've got to close loopholes in immigration law, because my guess is in 2 or 3 years from now, we could be back here saying, well, let's talk about the 10 million people that came in under the 4 years of the Biden administration, and half of them are children, or 2 million are children, and through no fault of their own, they were brought here. So let's talk about amnesty or a pathway for them. We've got to stop playing this game. You've got to close the loopholes. You deal with that DACA population through Congress. But you've got to close these immigration loopholes that we continue to talk about these classes of individuals here, and we continue to talk about pathways and amnesty. Let's actually just enforce the law. Let's bring in people into the country legally through legal visa programs. That should be the way that we administer our immigration program. And
speaking about potential congressional reform on immigration, there's been 2 competing bills in the past year, one from the Republicans in the House, H.R. 2, and then there's the so-called Senate bipartisan bill that has the backing of the Biden-Harris administration. Kamala Harris, of course, has been attacking Trump on this issue, claiming that he sank the bipartisan border bill in the Senate because he didn't want it to be a positive for the Biden-Harris administration heading into election season. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the Republican opposition to that bill was?
Well, sure. I'll just speak from my own perspective. As I looked at that bill, and I made sure I didn't comment on it before the bill language was released, but as I looked at that bill, it was unworkable. It was none of it was tested and true, meaning that you had about 300, 400, 500 pages there that was all new immigration law and putting new immigration processes in place. I don't think it would have addressed the crisis. It would have allowed up to 1.8 million illegal encounters or crossings per year. It would not have addressed the catch and release. It would not have addressed child smuggling. And then, of course, the trigger that a lot of Republicans and others that were talking about, to where you could, quote, shut the border down, of course, sunsets after 3 years under that bill, but all the other provisions remain in place. To me, as an operator, that didn't make any sense to me. How could Congress know that you didn't have a crisis in 4 years? And then you wouldn't be able to utilize some of that authority in that bill because it had sunsetted. So I think if you looked at the bill as a whole, you said, look, this is really not addressing the crisis. It didn't close many of the loopholes that we all have been talking about for years and years and years. And I think this is really startling that if the Biden administration felt so passionately about this bill, why didn't they offer it in 22 when we had a crisis, or in 23 when we had a crisis? They've had the ability to do something along that border using executive authority for 3 years now, and they've done nothing. And it was only until an election year that they decided to put their weight behind a bill so that they could say that they have done something about the border, when in fact that bill would have done very little. I assume that's why President Trump did not like it, did not support it. But I know that's why I didn't, and I've been very vocal about that.
Chad, I just wanted to broaden the discussion a little bit beyond immigration itself. You mentioned that you don't speak for former President Trump, and of course we accept your word on that. But the organization AFPI, it was set up by veterans of the Trump administration, predominantly, as I understand it. What is the actual function of the group? I mean, are you working toward offering some kind of blueprint for a second Trump administration if one comes into being?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, AFPI was created in 2021 after the Trump administration to take those America First policies that we saw during the first 4 years of President Trump that made the country prosperous, that made the country secure, and basically started to build that out here at the Institute. And so we've got 16 or 17 different policy centers, and we talk about things from national security, homeland security, like we're talking about now, but we talk about healthcare, taxes, and the like. And again, offering the American people that there's a different way to take this country, there's a different way to govern, there's a different way to approach some of these very, very tough issues that the American people are facing today, and it's not what we've seen of these America Last policies over the last 4 years. So that's what AFPI talks about. Most, if not all, of our research is online on our website. Anyone and everyone can go there and see about. We publish what we call the America First Agenda in 2022, both for federal and state legislators, policies that they could enact that promote national security, that promote national greatness, talks about patriotism. All of those things, again, they're all on our website, but that's the mission and that's the core of what we do each and every day at AFPI.
Any interest in going back into a second Trump administration yourself if that opportunity opened up for you?
Well, look, I think it's always, it's certainly an honor to be asked to serve. And I suspect that myself and many others, both at AFPI, but also not at AFPI, would probably, jump at the chance to serve President Trump again.
Chad Wolf, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
All right, thanks, guys.
President John Roberts? Not exactly, but he and the Supreme Court's conservative supermajority could determine the result of the presidential election. In a new article for the New Republic, writer Dave Daley argues that Chief Justice Roberts' life's work has encompassed, quote, remaking the law to undermine voting rights, boost Republican prospects, and award his side policy victories that could never be won at the ballot box, end quote. Daley says that Roberts is at the heart of the GOP, not Donald Trump.
Here to discuss this further is writer and senior fellow at Fair Vote, Dave Daley. He's also the author of Anti-Democratic: Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. Dave, thank you for joining us. Let's jump right in. I just want to start from a conservative perspective. Your assertion that John Roberts is the heart of the GOP would be one that would probably not be well taken by a large part of the Republican base who are quite angry with John Roberts for seemingly being too moderate on the court.
Certainly, there have been a couple of cases where Roberts has been the swing vote, especially if you're thinking about Obamacare back almost a decade ago. But I think if you were to look at the bulk of the Roberts Court's work, and if you were to look at where the court was in 2005 when Roberts comes on versus where the court and the Constitution are now, some 2 decades later, if you were to look at the court on reproductive rights, on gun control, on the regulatory state, on voting rights, the court has moved significantly rightward on all of those topics, and in ways that conservatives could scarcely have dreamed in many ways in 2003, 2004, when the court was still not going anywhere near, say, Second Amendment cases in the way that it has over the last 20 decades, when the court would never have taken on something as sacrosanct as the Voting Rights Act, let alone the regulatory state. So I would say in many ways that the victories that Roberts has delivered are monumental, and that in many ways he is the most effective Republican politician of his generation as far as what he has been able to provide and win for his side.
So to that point, Dave, just to sort of give our audience a little bit of an explanation as to where you're coming from on this, the article in the New Republic, correct me if I get anything in this summary wrong, but it essentially notes a ruling that was made in a case that involved gerrymandered districts, basically in North Carolina. And the Supreme Court, in ruling on that case, argued that state law and state courts do not evade, this is Mr. Roberts' words, do not evade federal law. State courts do not have free rein. So can you just, we'll probe this in a second, but could you just connect the dots between what you see as that ruling and the danger of a Roberts court doing something sketchy in relation to this year's presidential election?
Sure. This case involves something called the independent state legislative theory, which is a fairly fringy doctrine that has been advanced by some on the right. The argument essentially is that the elections clause of the Constitution gives state legislatures the full and unfettered power over election law and election procedures, and that power cannot be regulated. It's not subject to gubernatorial veto. It's not subject to state Supreme Court review. It's not subject even to state constitutions. And the Supreme Court knocked down in 2023 the most aggressive reading of this theory, but it left a rather large loophole. And essentially, what it said was, we think there's something here, but we don't know what exactly. And we'll let you know in a future case. And what I would suggest is that in the heat of a presidential campaign in this next 6-week period, in between the election on Tuesday and then the Electoral College meeting in mid-December, is when all kinds of cases, whether those from Pennsylvania or Georgia or elsewhere, some of which are already advancing through the courts, are likely to be decided by the US Supreme Court. And it would be extraordinarily useful if that standard were actually articulated in advance and if we knew what it was. Because we don't, it opens up all possibilities for chicanery and subterfuge and a decision that the country doesn't understand or accept.
What do you view as the most extreme case of this potential loophole?
I think what you are seeing right now with regards to cases that are advancing would be the case out of Pennsylvania regarding whether or not specific absentee ballots ought to be counted, whether folks ought to be given the right to come back in and cast a provisional vote if their absentee ballot is not counted. I think there's all kinds of other cases that are making their way through the system, particularly involving whether or not votes ought to be counted if they are postmarked ahead of Election Day but received afterwards. I think there's questions regarding certification, questions, say, if a state Supreme Court in Georgia or in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin keeps polls open for a couple of hours longer on election day because of long lines, and they say, well, anybody who's in line at this time ought to be able to cast a ballot, and that decision gets taken to court and appealed up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Is it possible that the number of votes that are cast, say, after 8 p.m. In Philadelphia or in Atlanta could be the tipping point in an election in extraordinarily close states, right? Where we're talking about 10,000 votes in Arizona last time, 11,000 votes in Georgia, in Florida in 2000, the case that led to Bush versus Gore, the difference was less than 550 votes. So one of these cases could very well control enough votes to tip an election. We have already seen, folks in Oregon and Washington, there have been fires set in drop boxes. Say there is a fire or a shooting at a vote counting center. If there's that kind of political violence, and state Supreme Courts make decisions about what to do and how to go forward. Some of this sounds a little bit fringy itself, but it's already happening, and we need to be aware of what the standards would be in advance if we want to actually have faith that a decision is not a partisan one.
Yeah, and just to distill this down, is your concern that the Supreme Court is going to rule only in favor of things that help President Trump?
I do think that what we have seen on election cases and democracy questions and general questions of voting rights from this court, whether you go back to the Shelby County versus Holder decision that cut out preclearance and eviscerated the heart of the Voting Rights Act, if you look at the redistricting decisions in Common Cause versus Rucho that effectively closed the federal courts to partisan gerrymandering claims at exactly the time that, bipartisan judges appointed by both presidents were beginning to come to an understanding of what the standards could be in order to keep the most extreme gerrymanders out of our political system and to put an end to them. That this court has really been the heart of Republican political power over recent years, and that it is a conservative supermajority right now that has 5 members appointed by presidents that lost the popular vote, that has 3 members of this court who worked as lawyers, who helped argue and develop the Bush versus Gore case. And if we want to have faith in that kind of decision, right? When Bush versus Gore came down in 2000, the country accepted that decision. The vice president at the time effectively conceded within the hour, and there were not protests in the street because the court had credibility amongst the American public. This court, I think, has been seen as very partisan.
And if I may jump in for a second here,
corrupt. And I would say that its standing among the public is at its lowest in history. So what would happen if this court issues Bush versus Gore in 2024? I hope we don't have to get there and find out.
Just looking at the last Supreme Court term, we did see that most of the opinions were unanimous and that a lot of them cut across typical ideological lines. So I wonder, is the lack of trust that you're talking about in the Supreme Court really due to their decision-making processes, or is it more about articles like the one that you've written, frankly, that suggests that there's some sort of shadowy plan or plot in place for the conservative majority, which we don't elect a president by popular vote, we elect by electoral college, right? Conservative majority is planning to somehow swing the election in favor of Trump.
I think if you were to look at the decisions that were unanimous, the court does a lot of things, some of which are highly technical decisions. Much of what the court does certainly is unanimous. But on the questions that have most shaped American policy and politics, this court has been deeply divided and really has been ruling along partisan lines for some time now. I mean, in many ways, these judges and justices ought to be wearing red and blue robes instead of black ones. And I think the American public sees this, understands this. Certainly, when you look at the amount of money and effort that goes into these confirmation hearings, they've essentially become political campaigns. The question, I think, is whether we want to have a 9-person body, whether that kind of power in a representative democracy ought to be in the hands of anybody who is unelected, who is appointed for life, who is subject to no ethics code, who is able to make their decisions in private, to have them be completely unreviewable. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, back in his first inaugural, said that if we are to outsource all of the questions of public policy to the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. And I think we are dangerously close to that moment right now.
Dave, our producers are trying to wrap us here, but I think Amber and I are enjoying the conversation too much. So let me just get one more in before we do finish, because I think this is really fascinating topic. So I think there are 2 separate arguments that I don't think we want to get confused, right? One is whether people like the current makeup of the Supreme Court or not, and the other one is whether the Supreme Court should have, as an institution, the jurisdiction to decide these kinds of questions that we started off with. Now, in your piece for the New Republic, you do mention, and this is the quote, someone, of course, needs to decide when elections go haywire. So who would you actually have decide that question?
It's a great question. I mean, I think ideally we have a Supreme Court that the country has faith in, that does not have an approval rating that is as low as that as used car dealers and, frankly, journalists like ourselves, right? So I think what has happened in many ways is that the court, through its own decisions, through the luxury vacations and the money that these justices have accepted over time has lost a lot of that faith and credibility, that the process has become so partisan, right? I think the American public sees tens of millions of dollars being spent by both sides to install these justices because they are precisely that. They've become an unelected a super legislature hanging over our politics. And that is not at all what the founders of the country wanted or tried to design here. And that if we have a court that is this unaccountable, I think all of us ought to think really seriously, regardless of what side we're on, regardless of how we see the current constitution of this court, as to what the role of a Supreme Court ought to be in a democratic nation and who ought to have this kind of power and what kind of checks ought to be on it. And as we head into an election that is going to be this close, in which those 9 people could have that kind of authority once again, as they did back in 2000, and there's no articulated standard, I think that really ought to concern all of us greatly.
My final disagreement with you would be that we shouldn't give journalists any more power, but Dave Daley, we appreciate you coming on the program very much. Have a great rest of your day.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Shark Tank star and VP Harris supporter Mark Cuban joined The View and made some controversial comments. The billionaire, who's been rallying his base to support Harris, was first asked about the state of the race. Let's watch.
And then you hear him say things like he did last night about women. I really think women are going to win this election for the vice president. I think they'll come out in numbers. I think they'll, not listen to their husbands. I think they're going to do the right thing and vote for the vice president.
Then came Cuban's remarks about the women Trump surrounds himself with. Let's watch.
Turns out Donald Trump is not even asking Nikki Haley for her help to try to reach her voters. What do you make of that? And do you think having people like Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, and other Republicans with Kamala Harris is going to put her over the edge with these Nikki Haley supporters?
Yeah, yes, it'll put her over the edge with Nikki Haley supporters. Donald Trump, you never see him around strong, intelligent women, ever. It's just that simple. They're intimidating to him. He doesn't like to be challenged by them. And, Nikki Haley will call him on his nonsense with reproductive rights and how he sees and treats and talks about women. He just can't have her around. It wouldn't work.
I think Stormy is intelligent. I don't think that's 100%. She's very smart.
Yeah,
Stormy.
He means is like,
but he means on stage. Yeah.
The internet lost it over those comments. Take a listen to Fox News' Kayleigh McEnany responding.
Okay, I had to take a breath before this because this is so profoundly offensive. I worked for Donald Trump. I consider myself a strong woman. I consider those around me strong women. Kellyanne Conway, Brooke Rollins, Ivanka Trump, Hope Hicks, Sarah Sanders. That's before we get to the women that Donald Trump elevated to very high levels, like Nikki Haley, who still supports him, like Amy Coney Barrett, who he put on the Supreme Court, or the women currently around him. Susie Wiles comes to mind, Caroline Leavitt. That is so offensive. And you know why? Because it's not just about the women who worked for him. He said the women around Donald Trump. This comes right after the Joe Biden garbage comment. Okay, the women around Donald Trump. What about the women who vote for Donald Trump? Are they weak? Are they dumb? Did Mark Cuban just insult any woman who supports Donald Trump? Because it's a little, very small step from that. And this is an official Harris campaign surrogate, Mark Cuban. That is misogynistic in my view. Get out of here, Mark Cuban. Kamala Harris, he's your surrogate. I want to hear from you. Do you agree the women are weak and ineffective, whatever he said? Get out of here. And I can't wait to hear from you, Kamala.
Republican Representative Elise Stefanik called him a sexist disgrace, while Trump said he was a, quote, dumb guy who thinks he's hot stuff.
Now, Cuban later tried to clarify his point on X, saying, quote, "This is what I said during a conversation about why Nikki Haley was not active in his campaign," to which View host Alyssa Farah Griffin agreed and said, quote, "This is how I took Mark Cuban's answer. Nikki Haley hasn't been welcomed on the trail with Trump because she challenged him too directly. That's simply true." So this is going to be, I think, maybe a little bit of a contentious debate, because it's certainly contentious over there. Kayleigh McEnany working herself up into quite a high tone of outrage about it. I think that, I think that Mark Cuban is prone to that thing that millionaires and billionaires are generally susceptible to, which is expressing themselves with an excessive amount of confidence. At least they can talk and not lose their voice, though, which I appear to be doing slightly. Pardon me. But I think that his point was too crude a version of a legitimate point, which is that Trump doesn't actually like to be challenged, generally speaking, whether it's with women or men. And there is additionally a history of making pretty off-color comments about women, saying about Carly Fiorina, look at that face, who would vote for that? The famous Megyn Kelly, blood coming from her wherever comment. And then just within the past couple of days making this statement that he's going to protect women whether they like it or not. So I think Trump's attitude toward women is fair game and can be fairly criticized. I think Cuban's phraseology was rather crude and hyperbolic.
Yeah, no kidding. Donald Trump, you never see him around strong, intelligent women ever. It's just that simple. I mean, he can clarify it and claim he was just talking about being challenged, but that's not really what he was saying in this initial statement. He does say he doesn't like to be challenged by them, but based on just people I know who've worked in the White House, people who are on the campaign, it's really not an accurate depiction. Trump doesn't like to be challenged by people who are stupid, I think is really what it is. But he has people around him who do talk to him about issues, and they debate what the best policy moving forward is. He doesn't really have patience for people who are trying to get him to move away from campaign promises that he made, things that he told the voters he was going to do. He doesn't like when people come in and say, no, we can't do that because of X, Y, and Z. He'll say, no, let's figure out a way to do it. So I think it's just a common misconception from the media that he just is surrounded by yes people. I don't think that's accurate at all. And I do think the comment from Mark Cuban was fairly offensive to a lot of the women who work for Donald Trump and probably don't appreciate being characterized as lapdogs that would never say anything negative or push back against their boss.
But you don't think that, I mean, Trump has reversed himself at various times with people who he has previously been extremely critical of, largely on the basis that they suddenly turn around and kind of suck up to him. So there's, I mean, the idea that these are sort of principled disagreements, I'm pretty skeptical of. It seems to me that if you take a Lindsey Graham or a Ted Cruz or whoever it should happen to be, he becomes a fan of people as long as they back him. Elon Musk would be another example of that, where there has been variations in that relationship. But Trump's warmth toward Musk seems purely based upon the degree to which Musk is willing to bat for his team.
I guess the question is, do you think that Musk and Lindsey Graham are using Trump, or if it's the other way around?
Well, no, that's a valid question.
Yeah,
no, absolutely.
So, I mean, that's part of it. Another thing I wanted to point out in this video is Mark Cuban doing this hit from his private jet, which is like just separately pretty hilarious. But look, the comment that Trump made about whether they like it or not was obviously very poorly phrased and similar to what Mark Cuban is arguing, that it was taken the wrong way. But this is such an unforced error for the Kamala campaign when they are making this argument that Trump is the one who's offensive and a bully to women and that they have this huge gender gap advantage. You have not only Mark Cuban coming out on the campaign trail for Kamala and making a comment like this, which is akin to Joe Biden's garbage comment, but you also have friends of the campaign running this ad with the voiceover from Julia Roberts suggesting that women lie to their husbands about who they vote for because if you're in a relationship with a Republican man, that he's going to be domineering or abusive even if he finds out that you voted for someone that he doesn't like. And even the idea that a married couple wouldn't know each other's politics or who they might be voting for, I find incredibly out of touch. The concept is very foreign to me, I must say. And then Kamala Harris during a recent rally having this Freudian slip where she says, I have fought for many who have harmed other human beings, trying to make this case that she's going to protect women unlike Trump because she has this prosecutorial experience, and unfortunately reminding people that she had donated to bail funds that let out violent criminals and also presided over this wide open southern border that allowed in murderers and rapists. So it was just a series of gaffes from the campaign that, at the very least in the Mark Cuban comments, I think Harris has to say something.
I think the one point there that I would disagree with you on, I think, is the Julia Roberts ad. Now, I'm glad to hear that you and your husband have a marriage where you discuss all these things very openly and candidly, and people have whatever views that they have. I am not totally convinced that every marriage in the country is like that, or that every marriage in the country has very candid discussions of politics, especially when we're in such a polarized time. And to me, the Julia Roberts ad, you could argue about the framing of it. Did it suggest that women were too timorous or their husbands too intimidating? You could definitely make that argument. But I think it was more just like, look, it's a secret ballot. Vote for who you believe in, not who you think is not only going to get sort of spousal approval, but who you think might get societal approval in your circle. Don't worry if you're bucking that trend to vote for whoever you wish.
Oh gosh,
we've been so agreeable.
I know. Sorry, that one is so
agree.
distasteful to me.
Fair enough. Well, that's how it goes. But I think that the Cuban thing is a distraction. I wonder sometimes if it's one of those ones where the outrage level is being amped up for political purposes. I think something like the Biden garbage comment was much worse.
I agree the garbage comment was much worse, but I still think that what Cuban said was bad and very demeaning to those women who work for Trump.
Fair enough. Well, we shall agree to disagree on that topic.
Sounds good.
We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this.
When President Joe Biden spoke earlier this week in a moment where he seemingly called Trump supporters garbage, White House officials went in high gear to walk it back. Now, the Associated Press reports that White House press officials altered the transcript of the call that the president had with Latino activists on Tuesday, in which he said, quote, "The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters." The transcript released by the White House press office had the quote written with an apostrophe, which aides said pointed to comedian Tony Hinchcliffe, who referred to Puerto Rico as a, quote, floating island of garbage during Trump's mega rally at Madison Square Garden last week. According to an internal email from the head of the stenographer's office that was obtained by the AP, the change to the transcript was made after the press office conferred with the president. The email's authenticity was confirmed by two anonymous government officials.
According to AP, one of the people on the email called the press office's handling of the matter a, quote, breach of protocol and spoliation, which is a word I love so much I'm going to say it again, the spoliation of transcript integrity between the stenography and press offices. Our stenography office transcript released to our distribution list, which includes the National Archives, is now different than the edited version and released to the public by press office staff. Well, here's a problem for President Biden and for Kamala Harris that the White House seems to be strangely hell-bent on extending by doing these kinds of things. They do say in politics that it's the cover-up that tends to hurt you as much as the initial deed. Here we are with another day of talking about this because of the insertion of the magic apostrophe, as I have christened it, into the transcript. I think it's a dumb thing to do. I know that they would have taken heat had they released the transcript without the apostrophe, but on the other hand, Karine Jean-Pierre or whoever could have just stood up at the podium and said, well, we think otherwise, and that would have been that. And instead, it has become this thing where now it's about the White House meddling with transcripts.
Yes, this is definitely a prolonged scandal because of their interference, and we talked about this earlier this week about how they do have a penchant for editing transcripts from Joe Biden, in a lot of cases to make them easier to read, because he does have these moments where he sort of stumbles over the teleprompter and goes off on tangents or what have you. But in other cases, in ways that actually change the matter of what he was saying. A perfect example of this, I brought this up earlier this week. He was speaking at the NAACP dinner. He said that he was VP during the pandemic, and the White House had actually crossed out pandemic in the transcript and put recession in brackets next to it. This is something they've done hundreds of times since Biden took office, and it undermines the meaning of what a transcript is, which is not, we're taking the speech that Biden was supposed to deliver and then sending it out afterwards because that's what he said. It's actually supposed to be what he said.
Yeah, and here I'm going to speak up for a very little known part of the White House bureaucracy, which is the transcript office. They take that job very seriously, as they should. They understand that it has been done for the historical record. As someone who's been in the White House briefing room at times and struggled to hear what other journalists have said, and has later looked at the transcript that is produced, they're very good at capturing verbatim exactly what happens. And here, that email that the AP got would indicate that they did communicate exactly what the president said, and that proved politically problematic, we surmise, from the press office's perspective, and was then changed. I know the argument is it's only an apostrophe. The point is it is changing the reality to comport with a preferred political imperative, and I think that is a problem.
And the fact that they talked to Biden before they finalized the transcript is a huge part of this too, because then he basically gets veto power over all of his gaffes.
What I really meant was...
Right, that's not what I meant to say, so don't put it in the transcript. I mean, that is a legitimate scandal, and of course, one of my favorite media trends that has been happening for the past 10 years, let's say, is the Republicans seize or the Republicans pounce, where the reaction to the scandal is made to be the scandal rather than the scandal itself. And I see a lot of that happening in this case, where they're like, well, Trump is seizing on Biden calling his supporters garbage by rolling up in the garbage truck, or Trump supporters are dressing up in garbage bags with MAGA hats for Halloween, pouncing on Joe Biden's comments where he had don't worry, he totally had an apostrophe in there. But I think they have a reason, especially considering this new information from the Associated Press, to be offended by what Joe Biden said.
No, I think they do. So my sort of position on this, so to speak, is I do think they have legitimate reason to be offended. I do think it's a serious matter to start meddling with the transcripts of what a president of the United States says. Not defending that at all. I also think on the political or electoral level, it's a dumb thing to do because, as I say, it prolongs a story which is very bad from Biden's perspective and therefore, by extension, from Harris's perspective. Now, the bigger point I would make, I guess, to a degree in defense of the overall picture is this now becomes the story rather than genuinely serious issues that Harris would have preferred to be pressing, whether that was the economy, whether it was protection of democracy. The speech at the Ellipse has now been almost forgotten, despite the fact it was, 2.5 days ago. These were things that I do think are absolutely legitimate for her to raise as part of her election campaign as we enter these final days. And they have now been eclipsed, washed away, obscured, whatever you want to call it, by this thing.
Yeah, very true. Another October surprise, I guess you could call it.
Too many October surprises. We got an October surprise with that Madison Square Garden rally, where I think that Trump and particularly the comedian were rightfully criticized, I would argue, and then we got the October surprise, the sequel with all this.
Right, and that's the other downside of this is in addition to washing away or distracting from Kamala Harris's policy pitch, which I would argue is not very good anyway, but of course that's a whole other segment. But it also obscured the original joke from the comedian at Madison Square Garden that became the subject of such ire.
Enabled Trump to turn the page on that.
Exactly. Yeah. All right, we have a lot more to cover here on Rising. Please stick around. We'll be right back. Joe Rogan was at it again this week as J.D. Vance joined his podcast, and Vance apparently caused some controversy for this comment. Let's watch.
And I think that, frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if me and Trump won just the normal gay guy vote. Oh, because, again, they just wanted to be left the hell alone, and now you have all this crazy stuff on top of it.
At another point in the conversation, Joe Rogan pushed back on J.D. Vance's abortion policies. Let's watch that.
Like the concept in the zeitgeist is that abortion had always been, Roe v. Wade had always been the law of the land, and then all of a sudden that was taken away, and you have these religious men who are trying to dictate what women can and can't do with their bodies.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, again, I understand that. I understand the pushback against that, but I think you can go, like with so many other issues, you can go way too far about it, and it becomes trying to celebrate something that at the very best, if you grant, I think, every argument of the pro-choice side, it is a neutral thing, not something to be celebrated.
I think
the two, however, could agree that Kamala Harris frequently talks in circles. Let's take a look.
This law, where are you going? Yeah. You want to get the lights that they use with air traffic controller, come this way.
Yeah, come this way.
Help her out. Do you think she wears an earpiece?
I wouldn't be surprised. I have no idea.
The earpiece one was amazing.
But man,
the little
she just
Bluetooth thing, the earring.
It's astonishing. She talks. The only way I can describe it is she talks in circles.
Yeah.
Right. It's like
Tim Dillon says it's like she does gypsy curses because she speaks in gypsy curses.
That's very good. But it's we need to build an opportunity economy, because if Americans don't have opportunity, then they're not going to have the opportunity to be Americans. And it's like, what the hell?
The opportunity
did
to
you
generate
just say?
wealth.
And JD Vance may have gained some brownie points from fans of the show Emily in Paris.
And we're sitting there watching like some stupid show, Emily in Paris, on Netflix or something, which, sorry, I don't mean to call it a stupid show. I actually think Emily in Paris is a masterpiece, but set that to the side. Bracket that one for now.
Emily in Paris. He might have just won the female vote, I got to tell you now.
I warned you before this, Amber, that I know nothing about Emily in Paris, so I have nothing to say on that point.
Totally fair. So just a little bit about it, because I think you'll find this funny. Good. So it is about an American who moves to Paris, named Emily, naturally, who goes to provide an American perspective to a marketing firm. So it's basically like the opposite of your life.
Well, I feel better informed already. I need. Is it on Netflix?
It is, and it's deranged. I mean, the plot lines are crazy. The costumes are awesome. People love the fashion. Love it or hate it. It's very, very polarizing. But it's just one of those classic, like, silly kind of girl shows. But apparently it's very entertaining and very digestible.
This is fantastic. My popular culture knowledge has been boosted by this segment alone.
Glad to hear it.
What did you make of JD on with Joe?
I must admit I haven't had the chance to watch the full 3 hours, so I don't want to comment too authoritatively on it. Based on the clips I've seen and the comment section reactions, people seem to think he did fine, that he came across as normal, likable, what have you, which I think is all you can really ask for when you're doing a 3-hour podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think those clips that we showed something that we've spoken about before, which is the idea that on Joe Rogan particularly, it's more about showing a human, regular person side of yourself. Some of the commentary there was pretty funny, even when it was mocking Harris, the air traffic control thing, or the
gypsy curses.
Gypsy curses. Those are good lines. I don't want to be completely humorless about it. I guess one of the issues I have with JD Vance sometimes is he has this propensity to when it suits him, be the person to say, well, you don't want to go too far, you don't want to go to extremes, and then talk in ways that I find very, very exaggerated. Now, one of the clips that we didn't play there, but I assure you I'm taking this quote correctly, is when he started talking about the use of DEI criteria to get people into college, or to get people into Ivy League colleges in particular. And he said he was basically suggesting that people who were not trans would present themselves that way to take advantage of DEI diversity measures. The quote was, "The only way that people can participate in the DEI bureaucracy in this country is to be trans." I want to stress there, he was talking about people who were not actually trans, pretending to be. That sort of stuff seems to me excessive. I mean, I guess it's one of those things where in a country of 330 million people, you could find 2 people who've maybe done that and then say, well, that proves his point. The idea that people in a general way are going to purport to be trans to get into college, I think is fanciful.
I'm not sure that I agree, and I'll give you 2 reasons why. The first is that when race was one of the qualifiers for affirmative action in college admissions, people like Elizabeth Warren, a prominent one, had this history, this documented history of either exaggerating or outright lying about her family's Native American heritage in order to apparently boost her academic career and gain some kind of favor with certain academic departments. And then, although we haven't seen really much in popular society, people pretending to identify as trans outside of doing it for joke reasons. It is a problem in women's prisons right now, where there are male inmates who will claim to be transgender so that they get housed in women's prisons, usually because the women's prisons aren't as rough and tumble, so you can protect yourself in some way. But also there have been a significant number of prison rapes from men who are pretending to be women who are housed in the women's jails. So I do think it is a legitimate issue that maybe is not one that is exploding right now, but I think he's identifying where it could go.
So I think you raise very valid points, but I want to distinguish, I think, those points from the issue of college admissions, because firstly, there's no mistaking the seriousness of the prison issue, where people who have male genitalia are getting themselves put in female prisons, and all of the risks of predatory behaviour and worse than predatory behaviour that entails. That is a very serious thing. Now, in relation to the likes of the Elizabeth Warren Native American heritage or Indigenous heritage thing, to me the distinction there is that there isn't really there is no negative for an Elizabeth Warren type person to say, oh, I'm Native American, whether she is or she isn't, and you get the advancement without any downside. It seems to me that the issue of saying one is trans, that just seems a more intimate thing to lie about, to be disingenuous about if your goal is simply to get into a college. That's a very different thing from the prison issue, where people for predatory reasons are pretending, in order to attack people in some cases, which of course I wouldn't make light of.
I definitely hear that point, but I wonder as far as the transgender ideology has gone in 2024, you don't have to make any effort to present as a member of the opposite sex. You don't have to undergo hormone therapy in order to be socially accepted as a member of the transgender community. And they also state that it's binary, or it's not binary, right? It's fluid. So you could be someone who goes back and forth, and who is the college administration office to tell you that you're not allowed to identify as the sex you were born as once you actually get into the school. So I think that's something that could be abused by people who are cynically trying to use it in order to advance their collegiate career. Is it going to be common? I find that very unlikely. But I don't think he's wrong to kind of raise that as sort of the logical conclusion of what that trend is leading to.
Honestly, one of the advantages, Amber, of having these kinds of conversations, which we've had civilly for most of the week, is that one hears views that you wouldn't have thought of. And the point that you raise about fluidity and how it is now commonplace, at least in some circles, to consider that as fluid, I honestly hadn't thought of that. And I think that's a fair point, that people that describing oneself as trans doesn't require necessarily, I'm even cautious about how I would phrase this.
Like a physical transition.
Exactly, like a physical transition, that one could claim some greater level of gender fluidity. So, yeah, fair point.
I like that. Let's get back to disagreeing.
Yes, exactly, of course. We'll find plenty to do that.
Let's talk about the normal gays comment.
Yeah.
I have to say, I have quite a few friends who might call themselves normal gays, and they thought this was hilarious. I saw it all over my Instagram feed last night of people reposting this clip and saying, like, proud to be one of the normal gays. But I could see how some could probably take offense to this. But I do think that the ones who were criticizing him for it were sort of deliberately not understanding what he meant, which was people who are attracted to members of the opposite sex but don't like the stuff that's going on in schools with maybe kids being exposed to that too early, or maybe don't like a lot of the transgender ideology. I think that's what he was getting at.
So that may have been what he was getting at, and I thought it was a weird comment rather than an offensive one necessarily.
Fair enough.
Just like normal gay guy, like, okay, whatever. But I think that, it's interesting to me the way you described that, because one of the things I think we have to guard against in a way is giving some people who we're ideologically sympathetic with the grace of saying, well, what he really meant was X, Y, or Z, and not giving that to people who we disagree with. And so we were having discussions about Mark Cuban elsewhere in the show about a comment he made, and it's like, it's possible that J.D. Vance meant how you characterized it. I just think that there is a certain combination of sort of oddness and presumptuousness to say, like, oh, we're going to get the normal gay guy vote. I must look and see if there is polling on, like, the gay gay vote, and I assume the gay community overall would vote more Democratic than Republican.
Yeah, I mean the one community that does lean more Republican than most of the LGBT community is the white male homosexual vote, which I think is, again, what he was getting at. And if you continue on through the clip, I saw a longer version on social media. He does say, the ones who don't believe X, Y, Z, etc.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I guess that gives some context.
A little bit more cover than I think maybe Mark Cuban got.
Yeah. Well,
although I'm sure I'm biased. Too. We all are.
I did see, and we didn't play it there, that Joe Rogan is still holding out hope of Kamala Harris coming on his show. I think it may be a fading hope, but we're on the record as agreeing that we would like to see that.
I would love that. Let's do it. I would actually make time for that, I promise. We have a lot more topics to cover here on Rising. Stick around. We'll be right back after this.
2020 was a year marred by civil unrest here in the United States. Sparked by the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed black man killed at the hands of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, riots and violence erupted and spread throughout the country in protest.
Washington, D.C.-based independent journalist Richie McGinniss was in the trenches then, traveling to different cities struck by violence, including Waukesha, Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, New York City, and Philadelphia, just to name a few. He put pen to paper, writing a forthcoming book, The Riot Diet, on the civil unrest of 2020 and 2021. The book is being released November 7th. Joining us now to dive in deeper is Richie McGinniss. Richie, thank you for joining us again on Rising.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I believe you also covered some of the inauguration protests in 2016 against Donald Trump. Obviously, we are just a few days out from the election on November 5th. From your experience covering these situations, what would be your prediction for what might happen if either Trump or Kamala ends up winning?
Well, I guess we can start with Trump, since you mentioned 2016. I think the difference between 2016 and 2024 is that, in 2016, people really didn't anticipate that Trump was going to win. I mean, the polls were putting Hillary Clinton, like at a 90% chance, over 90% chance of winning. And so when it did happen, it wasn't as if, the whole country was ready for that scenario. So we did see some small scale, there was a little bit of looting. There were a couple of cars that were torched in downtown DC immediately after Trump's victory. And then there was also some unrest during the inauguration. But this time around, I think that, after 8 years of Trump being in the picture, it's going to be a much different story because, people, I think, have soundly in their minds the possibility of Trump winning. And so if however many days it takes for them to count the votes, I do think that the backlash, if Trump wins, will be more significant than it was in 2016. As for if Kamala Harris wins, I think we look back to 2020, which I was on the ground for not only all the BLM unrest, but also the MAGA unrest that took place during the Stop the Steal rallies in DC, as well as January 6th, where I was on the ground covering the events for that. And what you saw there was basically, these elections, the election results coming in, them taking a significant amount of time to count the votes, and basically the escalating of anger on the Trump side of things as things didn't go in their favor. So I think we're probably going to see a scenario that's more similar to 2020 in that it will take, some states are already predicting that it's going to take some time to count the votes. So there will be this interregnum period during which we don't know who the next president of the United States is going to be. And as the votes are being counted, basically I think both sides will be gearing up for potential loss.
And Richie, to that point, particularly in the event of a Harris victory, I guess it sounds like from how you look at it that there's not much really that can be done to ameliorate that risk if there's a Harris victory, because the idea of protesting the election or contesting the election has been, so to speak, set up by former President Trump in advance. So you don't really think at this stage there's any way to avoid that kind of scenario if indeed Kamala Harris wins?
Yeah, I think, well, the one thing that you can do to avoid it, and this is what I saw over the course of the Stop the Steal rallies, is law enforcement being prepared for an influx, massive influx of people coming to DC to protest, as well as the counter protesters. As you well know, DC isn't exactly a Trump supporting stronghold. So on the first Stop the Steal, what we saw was a lot of people leaving that initial rally, which was down around the National Mall. And then as they were returning to their hotels, et cetera, they didn't quite realize, being from around the country, that they were walking straight through BLM Plaza, which, while wearing a MAGA hat, was effectively walking into a hornet's nest. So after the first Stop the Steal, what we saw was a lot of small-scale violence and assaults in and around BLM Plaza. And then Stop the Steal 2, which took place in December, that's when the Proud Boys came in force, and everybody was really ready for like a street battle. And we literally saw street brawls. I mean, it felt like we were covering some kind of medieval battle out right in front of Farragut Square, right by the White House. And so by the time January 6th came around, the question that I had when I arrived on the scene is, how come I'm better prepared than all the police? I had my gas mask, my bulletproof vest, my bulletproof backpack, my bulletproof helmet. And it just seemed to me that in the case of both Stop the Steal 2 and January 6th, Metro police were not reinforced, Capitol police were not reinforced in the way that they should have been. So hopefully the one difference this time around will be that law enforcement is really geared up and ready for that influx of protest and unrest.
That is especially interesting given what we know now about the FBI's tracking of some of the communications of people who were planning ahead of January 6th. Can you speak a little bit about how these riots on both sides get organized, and are the people who participate in them usually repeat offenders, or are there new people coming into the fold? Based on what we've seen about Antifa, for example, around the country, it seems to be generally a smaller group of very passionate people who are showing up consistently at all of these different riots.
Absolutely. And I think in both cases, on both sides of the political spectrum, what you had is a smaller group. Antifa is obviously this group that's very hard to define. It's not many people when you're out on the street are going to say, hey, are you Antifa? They're going to say, oh, yeah, of course I'm Antifa. But I was in a lot of these Telegram chats on both sides, both the Proud Boys and what you would call an Antifa group, anarchist groups who were planning these events. And what I saw in both the BLM case and in the case of the Stop the Steal rallies is it doesn't take that many people who are very serious about agitating and creating confrontations with the police in order for that to spread. I call it like the Lord of the Flies effect, which is if you see one or two people from your quote unquote political tribe get billy clubbed or pepper sprayed by police, then this different part of your brain, this animal reptilian part of your brain is what gets turned on. And once that fight or flight response is triggered and you have thousands of people surrounding an outnumbered group of police, things can get pretty bad, as we saw on January 6th. So I think, the FBI, as far as what law enforcement is monitoring, they were flying a drone and a Cessna over Kenosha, which I was also covering. And the question that begs is, if they're doing all this monitoring, and if they have all this information about what the most extreme elements of these various groups are doing, then why weren't places like Kenosha and the Capitol better reinforced for what they knew was coming?
And there's no question that that's a valid issue to raise, Richie, but do you have an answer to that yourself? What do you think the reason is?
What do I think the reason is that they weren't properly prepared?
Yeah.
That's the question that I've been asking myself over the 3 years that I've been writing these two books. This first book covers the BLM, second one covers January 6th and all the MAGA demonstrations. Well, for one, I think what we saw in the case of BLM is basically this battle between the federal government, Trump and his quote-unquote stormtroopers, and the local governments, the local police departments, local mayors, and local governors who didn't want, Trump to bring his feds in. And in the case of Washington, D.C., it was very similar in that you have a Democratic mayor, Mayor Muriel Bowser, and you have federal government that's seated here. So the difference here is now that we have an incumbent president who's a Democrat, and I don't see those political battles taking place in exactly the same way that they did then. But I do think that a lot of what happened back in 2020 had to do with kind of this political gamesmanship that was going on many levels above the street level. And as a result, in a place like Kenosha, the National Guard was allegedly there, according to the Democratic governor. But they were just surrounding the courthouse and they weren't protecting any of the businesses surrounding the area. So even in the cases where we did have like federal National Guard in place, their goal wasn't necessarily to protect anything beyond the courthouse that was, the ire of the protesters. So, I mean, I guess if I were to attribute one singular reason to why it is that we saw the law enforcement unprepared during that time period, it would be just simple political gamesmanship.
There's been recent reporting from some DC-based outlets that people are preparing to actually leave the city in advance of Election Day because of their concern about potential violence breaking out. If you were giving advice to people who are in the area, what would your advice be?
My advice to people who are in the area is, if you're going to go check things out, keep in mind what I just mentioned, which is the Lord of the Flies effect. Like once tear gas starts flying and pepper spray starts going into people's eyes, things change very quickly, and it's very easy to get caught up in that mob mentality. So, if you are politically active, if you want to get out there to support this candidate or that, just keep in mind that the only thing that violence will do, confrontations with police will do, is make your side look worse. And if you're just a resident who's just trying to stay safe, I would stay away from all the major areas that will probably be the centers of protest, namely the White House around the election time. And then as we near the counting of the votes, the Capitol and that whole National Mall area.
I just want to take a sort of big picture view before we let you go, Richie. In terms of, polarization or an undercurrent of violence, whenever people talk about the present day, where we are right now, sometimes people take a very, very dark view of it, think it's getting worse all the time. There's even some possibility of wider scale civil disturbance. Some people mention civil war. And then on the flip side, I guess you could say, you have people talking about how, well, America's been through lots of tumultuous times before. The most frequently cited is the late 1960s, when you had political assassinations, a lot of civil strife and so forth. How bad is the situation right now in your judgment?
Well, I do think I would probably fall into that latter category. We'll make it through this, and I don't think that we're heading for a full-scale kinetic civil war. With that being said, the difference today is that everybody has, in their pockets on their phones, they have like complete access to everything that's going on, and also these algorithms on these various social media platforms that really drive people into one of two echo chambers. So what's happening now is what's happening on the street is then being selectively edited and put into these two completely different realities on American social media feeds. And so I do think that, we will make it through this, but as we saw with the George Floyd protests and riots, and as we saw on January 6th, it's really, really easy for people to coordinate large events and for people to get really, really angry based upon, the clips that are coming through their social media feed. So I would just caution people to, when they see, a 6 or 10-second video come through their feed, try to take a second look at, okay, what was the bigger context around this situation? We had a couple of assaults, I remember, during the Stop the Steal 2 rally where MAGA guys were punched. And if you saw the longer clip, it turned out, that the guy had just kicked a woman. And so once you see the broader context, a lot of times it's not just as black and white as people think based on that first instinct.
All right, Richie McGinniss, author of Riot Diet. I believe that's available for pre-order on Amazon, so check it out. Thanks for joining us today on Rising.
Appreciate you having me.
Less than a week out from Election Day, just 150 billionaire families have smashed the billionaire campaign spending record, contributing a whopping $1.9 billion in support of the candidates. That's according to a new report from Americans for Tax Fairness. For context, the total donated in the 2024 campaign is almost 60% more than the $1.2 billion spent by over 600 billionaires during the 2020 campaign. So to name names, Elon Musk has donated at least $118 million into a Trump-supporting super PAC, while Michael Bloomberg and Bill Gates also donated $50 million to PACs supporting Harris. The ATF's director warns that, quote, billionaire campaign spending on this scale drowns out the voices and concerns of ordinary Americans, and it's a prime indicator that the system regulating campaign finance has collapsed.
Axios similarly writes that, quote, today's billionaires are shredding populist taboos, driving the news cycle, and increasingly shaping the terms of American democracy, and that the moral guardrails for political spending are vanishing.
Well, I think that I am more anti-billionaire than you are, generally speaking, Amber. So let me take up that baton. Look, free country, people can spend what they like. Yes, okay, fair enough. But the problem I find with this, generally speaking, regardless of which candidate or which super PAC they're supporting, is the drowning out argument that if you have essentially unlimited spending, you have people who are exceptionally rich being able to amplify their voices to such an extent that it is not solely a free speech issue. It is the issue that their speech makes it impossible for people without that wealth to be heard.
Yeah, I'm definitely sympathetic to that argument. I'm not a billionaire cheerleader by any means. Sure. I mean, I don't like Jeff Bezos, for one. We can just go there.
Go.
But
that's the specifics.
It's a little specific, but that's because I mean it.
Right. Excellent.
Yeah.
Why don't you sorry, not to divert us completely.
Oh, I think Amazon is a sweatshop horror show. That's one of a couple of reasons. Yeah, so I'm sure we agree on that.
Amber Duke coming over to the left at the end, where Amazon's labor practices are concerned.
I am the populist, the right-wing populist on the show, so we do have some agreement on economic concerns. And
absolutely.
So I guess my question then would be, what would be the reform to the system that would prevent things like this from happening? Would it be like a limit on people who have a certain net worth from donating? Would you have to have a certain percentage of your donations come from small dollar donors? I'm just curious how the regulation would work such that campaigns would still be able to get the money that they need to run a modern campaign, a modern sophisticated campaign, while also making sure that the people are actually heard in the process.
So I think you would just have limits to donations that are defined more broadly than they currently are. Right now, as you well know, the actual campaigns themselves, there are limits to how much you can give to Donald Trump for president, but you can give unlimited amounts of money to PACs and super PACs supporting that campaign. I think you would just cast those limits more broadly to make them not about only the official campaign, but about political spending writ large. Now, before our audience says, well, the Supreme Court disagrees,
I was just going to bring that up.
I know the Supreme Court disagrees, and I don't know how you would have those limits while that decision, or those actually more than one decision, has put that into law, or has interpreted the Constitution in that fashion. It's just that I don't think that is healthy for democracy. I don't think it's healthy for the country. I don't even really think it's healthy for debate in this country.
Well, we should bring back that Dave guy. I bet he has some ideas
I'm sure he does.
How to get the Supreme Court to get on board with this. Yeah. I do find it interesting that there haven't been more examples of candidates trying to distance themselves from the billionaire money. I mean, Kamala Harris in 2019 promised that she wasn't going to take any quote-unquote dark money, which is typically money that flows through super PACs to the campaign or is used on behalf of a candidate, rather. And then, of course, this time around, she's raising more money from billionaires than even Donald Trump has. I think the latest count was something like 5-1 in terms of spending. So do you think that it would be enough of an advantage with a progressive or populist base to eschew some billionaire donations in favor of appearing to be more independent from this big money? Like, do you think that the boost in potential popular support from the people would overcome the deficit that you would have from not taking the money?
I think it could, because as far as we know, she is getting quite a lot of small dollar donations as well, but it has been topped up by these huge donations to affiliated groups and campaigns. The other thing I would say, Amber, in relation to, couching that question, which is a great question about the, progressives, but I would define it more broadly than that, in the sense that one of the difficulties that Democrats have had recently and are having in this campaign is working class support generally. And that's not necessarily what we typically think of when we think about progressives, which is often a sort of highly educated but very left-wing kind of shadow elite, which I don't think is the sole appeal of refusing these kinds of donations. I think that there has been a failure on the part of a lot of leading members of the Democratic Party to actually be responsive to working class concerns. I think that is one of the reasons why there was that seemingly weird crossover back in 2016 between Bernie Sanders supporters, who some of whom ended up backing Trump,
right,
because it was people who felt that the game was rigged by powerful and particularly by financially wealthy interests. And so I think there is a political and popular support to be sort of harpooned by people who take a stand on that topic.
Yeah, and specifically to that point, one of the appeals of Trump was that he was mostly self-funding his campaign, and so he would argue, look, I'm not tied to these special interests or these billionaire donors. I'm a completely independent guy. What I tell you on the campaign trail is what I believe, and I won't have any money capable of swaying me to agree with some other position. And I think conservatives feel the same way about Elon Musk owning X, which is he's made it very clear that he really doesn't care that much if the company is profitable. He doesn't really care if people pull advertisements. He's told them to go F themselves, actually, because he has enough money to withstand a barrage of attacks and feels strongly about this principle of free speech enough to basically prop up the platform with his own money. But then the broader question involved in that is, okay, but what if you have a billionaire in charge of a platform that doesn't agree with the principles that you agree with? And should that entire infrastructure be completely dependent on essentially one person standing on the same side as you on the political aisle?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. I just want to circle back also to what you said about Trump and his appeal. I think it was partly that he was self-funding, but I also think more broadly, even people for whom other Trump views are anathema, I think did respond, particularly in that campaign, when he would talk about sort of having previously donated to candidates from both parties, and that issue would come up as a kind of a gotcha question, and he would typically say, well, no, it's because I understand how the game works, and if you want something from people, you give them money and they become more amenable to doing your bidding. If I recall correctly, like Dave Chappelle, of all people, has a bit about that, about the recognition among a large number of people who would not be conservative necessarily, that Trump was telling the truth, at least in that respect, as he characterized that element of the political system.
I think that's right. And there was a really important moment as well in one of the Republican primary debates of that cycle where he is talking about his opponents as being funded by special interests, of being tied to and accountable to the people who were donating to their campaigns. And the crowd started booing him. And he said, that's okay. You all are, you know who's in the audience, campaign consultants, donors, members of the party establishment, so you can boo me all you want, but you know I'm right.
Right, and those, I think those calls are very, very powerful, which again gets back to this thing about allying oneself with the quote-unquote billionaire class, I think is dangerous. And I think Trump seems to have avoided that with Elon Musk, the most high-profile person of that type, because Musk himself is seen, rightly or wrongly, as a sort of maverick. I'm not a big Elon Musk fan, but he's not easily characterized in the same way. I think, you know, any time that there's this sort of perception of Wall Street billionaires are on the side of this candidate or the other candidate, I just think that the downside to that in terms of how it is perceived by the general public is very, very substantial.
Yeah, particularly as anti-corporate sentiment continues to grow on both the left and the right.
Absolutely.
That's actually going to do it for us this week on Rising. And Robbie, surprise, we'll be back here on Monday. Good news. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Have a great weekend.